That's the end of those speeches, and now I'll give the floor to Mr. Della on behalf of the Council. Thank you very much, President. I'd like to thank the members who took part in the debate. The message of the European Union is strong and clear. A military solution cannot bring lasting peace to Libya. The present crisis can and must be dealt with through peaceful negotiations which will open the way for a political process. The European mission EUBAM Libya, which has as a goal that of helping the Libyan authorities in managing its borders, is ready to resume its full activities, its full operationality as soon as security conditions allow this, and they will actually adapt the mission to the new realities that will be emerging in Libya. We trust that the mediation efforts carried out by the UN mission to support Libya with the help of the European Union and the various special envoys will start to produce results. And the reports that have come in after the most recent visit show that there is a possibility of a change to the dynamic there, and there is the presence of an increasing determination of both sides to achieve an agreement on the basis of principles which will guide the future political process. The international community must do all it can, expend all its energies in order to support these efforts and to add to these efforts and complement them, and also apply in the meantime the relevant resolutions of the Security Council of the UN, and abstain in the meantime for actions which run the risk of exacerbating the tensions. We trust in a positive result from the ministerial meeting of today in Madrid, and a positive result from the meeting in New York that's going to take place. These high-level events which are being held one after the other, including this debate, we hope these are evidence of the fact that the world is following closely what's happening in Libya. The international community is strongly committed to supporting the silent majority of Libyans in their fight for a peaceful and a prosperous existence. Thank you very much, Minister Della. I've received 7 motion resolutions in order to wind up the debate. The debate is now closed and the vote will take place tomorrow at midday. I have an announcement for the House. I received from the ECR group a few proposals for nominations to committees and interparliamentary delegations. The list of these nominations will be appended to the minutes of today's session. If there are no comments or objections by the adoption of the minutes, these nominations will be deemed approved. And now, in accordance with the agenda, we have a statement by the Vice President of the Commission, High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, on the Israel-Palestine issue after the Israel-Palestine situation after the Gaza the war and the role of the EU. I'll give the floor to Minister Benedetto della Vedova. Thank you very much, President, honourable members. The ceasefire of the 26th of August, which brought to an end 50 days of terrible violence between Israel and Palestinian groups in the Gaza Strip, was welcomed by the European Union and by all the international community, putting an end to a cycle of violence which caused more than 2,100 deaths on the Palestinian side and 71 deaths on the Israeli side. This ceasefire allowed us then to launch a humanitarian assistance program which was extremely necessary and which now still has to deal with considerable difficulties. The agreement for the ceasefire has not yet, however, guaranteed the possibility of overcoming the previous status quo. This aspect is of crucial importance, and the various conclusions adopted by the Foreign Affairs Council and by the European Council over the last few weeks underscore this in a very clear fashion. What is necessary is a lasting solution for the Gaza question, which deals in a decisive way both with the problems of the people of Gaza and the problems of the people of Israel. What we need is a broad political agreement which will cover the problems of Gaza in the context of a peaceful and global solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. For the European Union, there's never been any doubt about the fact that Gaza has to be part of a future Palestinian state. The efforts are now continuing for resuming the process that was started with the ceasefire on the 26th of August. On the 20th of September, which is within the time period of 1 month that was established, Egypt should be inviting once again the two parties, or the various parties, to Cairo for the important negotiations on key points that were still unresolved in August. On the one hand, there are requests from the Palestinian side for the opening of a maritime port, a seaport, and the reopening of the airport. And moreover, from the Israeli side, there are requests concerning security and the demilitarization of the Gaza Strip. In parallel, members of the UN Security Council are seeking a consensus for the adoption of a resolution which would create an international context designed to bring about the normalization of the situation in Gaza. You can't deny that there is a great deal of uncertainty about the outcome of all these negotiations, but one thing is sure: the European Union and its member states will leave no stone unturned in trying to achieve a result which is satisfying for all parties involved. The European Union is also mobilizing efforts in order to make a concrete and practical contribution to the reconstruction of Gaza. Obviously, the UE's ability to give substantive help is strictly linked to the political process that I've just described. Political stability will be of crucial importance in order to succeed in supplying humanitarian assistance and in order to be able to continue to provide stable support. With that end in view, it would be crucial for the Palestinian Authority to set up again in Gaza, and for the Palestinian Authority to be able to take control of security once again. The EU missions already there, UBAM Rafah and UPOL COPS, could be a good point of departure as long as the different parties achieve an appropriate agreement, and as long as the situation in Gaza improves from the point of view of the conflicts underway there and from the point of view of security. The European Union calls upon the Israelis and the Palestinians to choose peace and the resolution of the conflict which has been pitting one against the other for too many years. It's the time for the leaders of the two sides to adopt courageous decisions which are necessary in order to put an end to the vicious cycle of conflict and to resume negotiations. You can rest assured, dear colleagues, that the European Union, with your support, will do all it can to achieve this goal. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Minister. Let's open the debate. The first speaker is Mr. PREDA, who has 2 minutes.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd like first of all to welcome the 26th August ceasefire and the role of Egypt therein after 7 weeks of conflict. Both sides need to work for a sustainable solution, and I hope that Egypt will continue to play its mediating role. The recent conflict has cost many human lives and much human suffering. I'd like to express all my sympathy and compassion for the victims and their relatives. I welcome the fact that the Israeli authorities have committed themselves to investigating any activities by the Israeli defense forces that are reported. The Gaza humanitarian situation is very worrying. There are humanitarian needs on the ground, and there is a need for political will and the financial resources to put that situation right. In the Foreign Affairs Committee, there was a broad political consensus behind the idea that the UNRWA should see its budget increased. Gaza reconstruction is extremely important. I welcome yesterday's agreement on an interim mechanism for the reconstruction of Gaza under the aegis of the United Nations, ensuring that reconstruction will be of a civilian nature. I hope that the European Union will make a substantive contribution to the reconstruction process. A few words now on the EU's role in the world. The EU is making a contribution to a sustainable solution for the Israeli and Palestinian people. All of us want a just and lasting peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now Mr. Bostinaro has the floor. I'd like to remind you that we are flexible, but let's try and stick to our speaking time if we can.
Grazie, Presidente. Dear colleagues, I would like to mention that the resolution which is about to be adopted tomorrow, it's a well-balanced resolution, and it is again the result of a close and serious work of our political groups, which shows the commitment of the European Parliament to fight and work for peace in the Middle East. Now, without mentioning numbers, damages, losses which are part of the daily tragedy we faced on Gaza Strip, I would like to mention that Europe was practically missing and not living up to his duty in recent months in the Middle East, nor during the USA brokered negotiations, either during the ceasefire. And it's a fact of life, and it's a painful lesson on what to do. I will refer on what to do, having inspired also the visit we had in Jerusalem and Ramallah. First, the implementation of the ceasefire agreement is fundamental, but also a good start for the negotiations which will soon take place, which will face the most important topics on the agenda. The second, a successful donors conference in Cairo to give the opportunity for starting the reconstruction of Gaza. Third, to empower the national consensus government of Palestine to take full control over Gaza. Without that, the reconstruction will be at jeopardy. And finally, to strengthen the role of President Mahmoud Abbas and its moderating authority to negotiate with the Israeli side. Finally, I would say that the most important is to work for the peace process, and here our Union, together with the United States and with important regional actors as Egypt, Saudi Arabia and others, should give our contribution for the success of the talks. Finally, I do believe it's the time Europe to change from player to pair to player. Pair it was, but we have to become player, and for this reason I'm very happy that the newly designated High Representative Federica Mogherini, she pays so much attention to Middle East and for the role of our Union trying to work for peace in the Middle East. This is the only answer for the region in a time of high instability. Thank you. Grazie.
Grazie, onorevole. La parola.
Thank you very much. And now Mr. Belder has the floor for 2 minutes.
Ja, dank u wel, meneer de voorzitter.
Thank you very much. Thank you, President. A week ago, I went to the south of Israel, to the Negev, and that's just a few kilometers from the Gaza Strip, and I saw with my own eyes the tunnels used by Hamas terrorists. The local population in the western part of Negev, for 1 year now, for 1 year they have been experiencing Hamas rockets. Now, we're having this debate here in the EU after the most recent armed conflict between Israel and its Islamist enemies in Gaza. What should the role of the EU be in this conflict, which seems inevitable? Well, Hamas is in charge of Gaza, and Hamas is also on the list of terrorist organizations, so it seems to me that it stands to reason that the EU should be on the side of the state of Israel, protecting them against Hamas. In tangible terms, this should mean that the EU should implement whatever measures necessary in order to demilitarize the Gaza Strip, and therefore I'd like to ask Council whether you share that analysis and whether you intend to take the necessary steps in order to allow for the peaceful resolution of the Israeli-Arab conflict. In any event, when it comes to EU aid should not be used for re-militarization on the Gaza Strip, nor indeed for the resurgence of Hamas. If the EU wants to play a role, it needs to have good relations with Israel, and that includes the Association Council. The last 2 years, 2013 and 2014, the meetings of that entity did not take place, which is very negative in terms of our relationship with the State of Israel, and we deplore that.
Thank you, Mr. Belder. Would you accept a blue card from Mr. Pargneux?
Oui, une question à notre...
Yes, a question for our dear parliamentary colleague. Could you tell me how many women and children who, during the 7 weeks of conflict, who died?
Dank u wel, meneer de collega, voor uw vraag.
Thank you. Thank you very much to my dear colleague. Why don't you ask Hamas? Why don't you put the question to them? Why don't you ask them? I mean, after all, who did they sacrifice in order to keep their power? I think their methods are similar to those of the Islamic State.
There's another request from David Martin. You have the floor.
Thanks, President. Mr. Belder, 2,000 civilians died in the Israeli bombing, 450 of them children. Do you really think that the European Union should be on the side of a country that's prepared to sacrifice innocent civilians for its own political ends?
Ik wil de heer Martin er nogmaals op wijzen.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. I would like to emphasize one thing, namely this. Hamas is using its civilian population. It's using it in order to justify terrorism. They're using the social media as well, and I can assure you that as far as the Israeli side is concerned, all measures are being taken, but the Israeli state has to be able to defend itself. You always have to see both sides.
There's another question for you, Mr. Belder, and this is from the Honourable Member, Mrs. SAKORAFA. Thank you, President. I'd like to ask the colleague whether this terror organisation, Hamas, whether he accepts that this legally elected government has to govern the Gaza Strip. Should we not respect those elections? Mr. Belder.
Zelf aanwezig geweest bij in 2000.
Madam, I was there in 2006 when the elections were being held for the Palestinian Authority, for the Palestinian Parliament. And once the two-state solution was rejected, well, obviously all we can do is deplore that, and all we can do is deplore the way things have turned out.
2 minutes.
2 minutes of Mrs. NEYTS-UYTTEBROECK.
President, we heard the president of the delegation with Israel, and so we should not be surprised that his sympathies go mainly to Israel and the politics of its government. One could share in the sympathy with the state of Israel, but not necessarily with that of the politics of the present Israeli government. It's something different. Now, when I heard the debate on the numbers of victims on either side, this reminded me of a meeting I had with the chief negotiator of the Palestine side, Mr. Nabil Erekat, who I was Minister for European Affairs at the time of my country, Belgium. And he told me, Madam, we are drowning in our children's blood. The Israelis and ourselves are drowning in our children's blood. Now that was 10 years ago. And since then, things haven't exactly improved. On the contrary, they have got worse, so it seems to me. And I would try to encourage us to abandon the arithmetics of death and to engage in the difficult path to peace. And I believe that it is very important that in this very joint resolution of today, we state, and I believe it's the first time we do it so clearly, I mean, if a majority, which I expect tomorrow, approves the joint resolution, I believe it's the first time we say so clearly that in any case the status quo is unsustainable. In other words, that to just return to the status quo ante, the situation as it was before the ceasefire was, let's say, interrupted, offers no solution and offers no solution to a sustainable new situation. And I believe that it's an important statement. If this Parliament makes it, it means that we support the efforts of the High Representative, of the Commission, of the Council to the path of peace. Thank you.
Grazie, onorevole.
Thank you very much. Now, Mrs. Anderson, 2 minutes.
Going Margaret. Israel's attack on Gaza resulted in killing 2,147 people. 500 of 3 were little children. These were crimes against humanity under international criminal law and international humanitarian law. Recently, 13 MEPs were refused access into Gaza because Israel did not want us to see the destruction there comparable to World War II. On fact-finding in the West Bank, we MEPs witnessed the South Africanisation of Palestine with its apartheid roads, walls and buses. Israel's violations of international law are well documented, in fact, on 6 occasions by the UN Security Council, plus the International Court of Justice. The clearest violations are the illegal transfer of 600,000 Israelis to live in illegal settlements in occupied Palestine, where 170,000 acres of Palestinian land has been confiscated since the Oslo Accord, 1,000 acres alone last week. International law imposes a duty on all members of the international community, including the EU, not to recognise as lawful or render aid or assistance in maintaining a situation created by a serious breach of international law. Allowing economic relations with Israeli illegal settlements and importing their products into the EU contributes to the prosperity of settlements and assistance in their development, all of which is contrary to obligations under international law. Those who make the law must uphold it. The EU must not simply discourage business relations with firms established in illegal settlements and only insist on correct labelling of settlement goods. It must halt all relations with Israel and prohibit imports of its goods. After all, what happened in Gaza over 51 days makes us look at Article 2 of the EU-Israeli Association Agreement, which must be implemented, and if it is, that means that the Association Agreement must be suspended. Thank you.
Grazie, onorevole.
Thank you very much. Now, we have Mr. Meseric for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. As a seasoned diplomat told me the other day in relation to the Gaza war, once hostilities stop, actually incentives for politicians and actors to engage in serious diplomacy very quickly fade. We have a very small window of opportunity. Now, the title of this joint resolution indicated that the EU and the European Parliament is willing to make a bold step in the direction of becoming a serious actor in the Middle East peace process. Now, unfortunately, this resolution does not really deliver on its title. I would have loved to have that, but we are unfortunately unable to co-sign to it, basically because unless the forthcoming negotiations in Cairo are broadened to include much more than simply the ceasefire agreement between Israel and the Gaza authorities, there is no hope for any meaningful peace process to be started. Now, Mr. Della mentioned that the EU will leave no stones unturned. In fact, I believe that this is I hope that he is right about that, but this resolution may be more famous for what it actually lacks, what it misses, than what it says. It is actually a joint resolution of exactly the stones unturned. My colleague has already mentioned a number of them. Let me just add two. Requiring accountability for all violations of international humanitarian law by all sides is a minimum requirement for a meaningful peace process, I believe, and we believe. Endorsing UNRWA's request for all these accountability measures, plus humanitarian aid to go actually unimpeded into Gaza, is a minimum requirement. This could not find its way into the joint resolution, as well as a minimum request for an ad hoc delegation by this very Parliament to see the facts on the ground. At the end of the day, unfortunately, we cannot support it, and the window of opportunity, as I say, is closing very quickly. Thank you very much.
Grazie. Onorevole.
Thank you very much. Mr. Castaldo for 1 minute. Thank you, President. Colleagues, after a war you count the victims, you mourn them, but you don't weigh them. Israelis 550 wounded and 70 killed, some children. The Palestinian 2,000 dead, 500 dead children. In the last decade, every conflict was more bloody than the one before. When will our consciences stop being able to tolerate this slaughter? Are we waiting for the point of no return? No, we mustn't wait for things to get even worse. If Israel wants to justify in a legitimate fashion its security, and how can we get them to understand that the only way to defeat terrorism and extremism in the Gaza Strip is to allow Palestinian people to have justice, social justice and human rights. We've got to put an end to the embargo. We've got to push for the creation of a seaport and push for the reopening of the airport. And as the European Union, we've got to make a contribution to increasing the action of UBAM so that there can be no trafficking of weapons. We do have an opportunity, but with window of opportunity because of Egypt's opening of this negotiating period of this ceasefire. We've got one chance. Let's seize it for two peoples. Thank you very much, Mr. Castaldo. There's a question for you from Mr. Belder. Do you accept it? Yes, he accepts it.
Ja, ik heb een simpele vraag aan de heer Castaldo. Wat vindt u nou?
A very simple question. Hamas killed 20 collaborators publicly. Isn't it a terrorist movement?
Grazie per la domanda.
Thank you for the question, colleague Belder. I think I already answered in my speech when I said that in my personal view, the causes of terrorism and extremism, injustice, is that there is no social justice. The people are poor, they're desperate, they are suffering because of this embargo. Let's resolve this problem, and then the Palestinian people will move away from extremism. And because, as a colleague said earlier, it's been years now that they've been losing their children, that they've been swimming in blood. It's time to put an end to that. Thank you very much. Mr. Papadakis, 1 minute.
Thank you very much, President. Israel's aggressivity seems to know no bounds. There were bombs raining down, and I think it made it quite clear that the Palestinians were the victims. The EU, too, supported that analysis. There were refugees. There were also, of course, people dying, refugees who died off the coast of Malta. Now, measures have been suggested, and these measures would help rebuild the Israeli military, it would appear. Economic relations with Israel, political relations with Israel, but as far as the EU is concerned, and indeed my own country, I think they are deplorable, and I think we need to show solidarity with the people of Palestine. They want an independent state within the borders of 1967, East Jerusalem as a capital. There should be sovereignty.
Thank you. Mrs. Alliot-MARIE, 2 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. In modern wars, it is civilian populations that suffer the most in human and material terms. In the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there have been decades of unnecessary civilian suffering on both sides. And yet, there are many on both sides, in Gaza and in Israel, who refer to how they used to celebrate each other's religious feast days. I have met many people on both sides who want to see progress. Terrorism flourishes on the back of this conflict, as do the extremists. The European Union hasn't really done much to solve this conflict. Over and above our fine words, we need to come up with rapid, tangible solutions to help the civilian populations. We also need to conduct effective diplomacy to build the necessary trust. On both sides, pragmatic forces are very close to a shared idea centered on the two-state solution and security guarantees for Israel. Trust is necessary. Egypt is playing its role. We have to play our role. Time is ticking for the local populations and for ourselves.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Valenciano Martinez Orozco has the floor for 2 minutes. Thank you, President. A child, which is now 6 years old and lives in Gaza, has lived through 3 wars already. What sort of future does this child have? What sort of life can take place in such a context? And we came just back just now from Jerusalem and Ramallah. What I saw on this occasion is that the Palestinian leaders are fed up. They're absolutely fed up. They've been trying to create peace for many years. I'm talking here people who are experienced, people who are good negotiators, but they're so fed up. I've never seen such despair as I saw in their eyes. Every day without a solution is a terrible backsliding. So we shouldn't see the world in black and white terms, but you can't strike a balance either, because there is no balance. There's only imbalance. And I'd like to say to Mr. Belder, and I'm going to answer you, you know that there is an occupying force, there are occupied territories. You know that the occupiers do have responsibility towards the people in the occupied territories, and those who are living in the occupied territories have always had the right to self-defense. And this is the first time in history that that people living in occupied territories have to defend themselves in this way. We've got to find a solution. The first is to rebuild after the destruction, and then secondly is demilitarization. A third thing is a political impulse. The European Union is completely absent from the stage, and that is the truth. And here we should remember what Mrs. Mogherini said recently. The European Union is absent, but that's also our fault. We've got to help to find a solution for the Middle East. And when it comes to security has to be one of our priorities, but security for the people of Israel and security for the Palestinian people and for the members of the Palestinian Authority who are in jail without trial, and if they do go to trial, it's to a military tribunal. And we have security for Palestinian children and security for Israeli children. And at the moment, balance is destroyed by imbalance. What we need is justice and peace.
Grazie.
Thank you very much. Now we have Mr. Tomasic. 1 minute. Mrs. Tomasic.
Thank you very much. Nedavna eskalacija nasilja u pojasu Gaza.
The recent escalation in violence in Gaza started off as an act of revenge by civilian victims. It caused a lot of victims and more victims still. I think our priority should be to protect civilian victims, because they are the targets of these actions, military actions. The Hamas doctrine does talk about the terrorization of the civilian population, and it calls for a cause that we believe is contrary to human civilization, but it is successful, particularly because the West seems to be very sympathetic to the arguments advanced by the Palestinians. Now, this is not an exoneration of the Israeli authorities, because they don't seem to care about civilian security either. There's no justification for the murder of civilians. An innocent victim is an innocent victim, regardless of the side they stand on. Let us continue to talk about these clashes between Israelis and Palestinians, but what about trying to find a solution? We don't seem to be trying to do that.
Un minuto.
1 minute, Mr. VAJGL.
Presidente. Spoštovani, ko sem v preteklem mandatu obiskal
Mr. President, in the last parliamentary term, I visited Gaza, and I saw witnessed the death of a group of children playing football. This motion for resolution is an expression of our discomfort. There need to be two states that mutually recognize each other based on the 67 borders. The occupation of the Palestinian territories kicks this objective into the long grass. Until the Israelis and Palestinians agree on coexistence, there will be ever more victims, and there will be ever more destruction of what the EU and the international community helped to rebuild. This is a conflict that cannot be resolved using weapons, but through peace talks.
Un minuto.
Thank you. Mrs. SAKORAFA, 1 minute. Thank you, President. One of the most recent crimes mean that the international community now has to speak with a clear language. We need an independent Palestinian state within the 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital. We need the return of the refugees to their homes. At the moment, we are proposing a motion for resolution which doesn't mention the settlements, doesn't mention refugees, doesn't mention resistance in the Palestinian areas. We're not talking here about two different parties, two different camps that are at war with each other, different sides, and there are no protected ends here either. It's just a question of an attack of a very strong military. There's an apartheid situation in the Gaza Strip, onslaught by a very strong military, and the Israeli people has to be protected against the crimes committed by its own government. The German people was condemned for the crimes of the Nazi regime, and we had hoped that that at the end of the Second World War that would be the end of that black chapter of history, but we didn't see that the same problem would arise again with Israel. Thank you. Mr. Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Green Group won't be supporting this joint resolution as it fails to properly address either the causes or the solutions to the conflict between Israel and Palestine. Our alternative resolution highlights the gross disproportionality in the violence and the casualties of the Gaza war and holds both sides to account. It stresses the positive roles for both the EU and the new Palestinian unity government as brokers for peace, and calls for the lifting of the illegal blockade of Gaza and to extend the permitted fishing zones and open the border crossing. And finally, we recognise the danger that Israel's recent and largest land grab in 30 years represents to the Palestinian interests and to the delivery of the two-state solution. Overall, the joint resolution fails to call for any of those things. It's weak, it's biased, it's factually incorrect, and offers no sensible Parliament role for the EU's future role in the aftermath of this vicious war. Thank you.
Grazie, onorevole.
Thank you very much, Mr. CORRAO. 1.5 minutes. Thank you, President, colleagues. The conflict between Israel and Palestine represents probably the emblem of stupidity, of lack of sensitiveness, and the inability of human beings and the impotence of international organizations of whatever type or origin. Ever since I've been a child, ever since I can remember, the message that I constantly got from that part of the world was a one-way street. Bombings, destruction, hundreds of dead, madness, war, an unending war. A war like every other war. It has neither winners nor losers, only victims and the defeated. And what changes now for the Israelis or for the victims? You have orphans, you have people who are homeless, you have people who are in the desert. And does it matter to them where the bombs came from east, west, or from the right or from left? Too many speeches, too many fine speeches, too many tears wept, and too many resolutions in the United Nations, and now too many weapons sold to those people who use them in an inappropriate, crazy way without a conscience. There are thousands of civilian prisons, many held in Israeli prisons without without proper trials, and these prisoners must be released. I'd like to conclude by the European Union brings together the states who are responsible for the historical changes in the world. We were able to bring an end to conflict on the European continent. Now we have to do more. We have to ensure that the most basic international conventions are respected and that the principle of self-determination for peoples is respected. Thank you very much. And now Mr. de Graaf, 1.5 minutes.
Ondanks het staakt het vuren heeft Hamas ook gisteren weer een raket op Israël afgevuurd.
At the last ceasefire, Hamas actually launched rockets against Israel. It's a bit like Boko Haram or the Islamic State. This too is a terrorist organization. Hamas must be destroyed. The Palestinian Authority can deplore the violence exercised by Hamas, but it's done nothing to protect its citizens. Financial support from the EU is not really helping them build infrastructure, it's actually subsidizing material. And therefore the EU should no longer be an accomplice when it comes to the murders carried out by Hamas. We should stop all financial aid to the Palestinian state. We should neutralize Hamas altogether and recognize the rights of Israelis.
Thank you, Mr. Howitt. 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, President. This is our first opportunity to react to the temporary ceasefire in Gaza, and perhaps even more important, our last chance to comment 8 days before the deadline to secure a permanent ceasefire and ensure there is no more violence. Today our Parliament must support the EU representative in insisting that there must be no return to the pre-war status quo in Gaza. The humanitarian crisis started not with the 50 days of Operation Protective Edge, but with the 2,500 days of the blockade which preceded it. The EU must contribute humanitarian assistance, but now must act politically too, to prevent being trapped ourselves inside the seemingly endless cycle of destruction and reconstruction. I encourage and welcome diplomatic engagement with other regional actors, further efforts to build Palestinian reconciliation and renewed discussion about a new role for the EU Border Assistance Mission. But after the failure to follow up the Goldstone Commission, I hope the fact that the new UN Investigation Commission on War Crimes includes a lawyer due to be married to George Clooney means its work will have more substance than the Hollywood Dream Factory. President, 500 children died in the Gaza conflict. 63,000 people were forced to shelter in just 29 UN schools. The attacks on those schools were called criminal by the UN Secretary-General and a war crime by Human Rights Watch. A child of 6 in Gaza has now lived through 3 wars. We should uphold the Palestinian Authority and support it when it says it wants to see in Gaza, I quote, one authority, one gun, one law. But most of all, we should work with both Israel and the Palestinians towards the day when not even one gun is needed to preserve peace and security for all.
Grazie, onorevole. Thank you. Mr. Zardil, 1 minute.
Mr. President, in the last few weeks, Israel has faced attacks on its territorial integrity and its very future existence. There are two streams in Palestine. There are those who want peace and are ready to agree, and there are those who don't want to agree, who just want to destroy the state of Israel, and that's Hamas. The European Union is sending considerable financial assistance to Gaza, and I think Council and Commission should be required to carry out an impact assessment to find out whether this humanitarian and development assistance to Gaza is actually having any positive effect on the peace process, or could it be the case that that aid is being abused by those who are firing rockets at Israel? That would be a scandal. The European Union should only support those who want a peaceful solution and not those who want a continuation of war. Thank you.
Onorevole Rodriguez.
And now, Mrs. Rodriguez-RUBIO, 1 minute. Thank you, President. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a lot of data, but there's one piece of data missing. Do you know how many Israeli civilian victims there were in the 7 years of war? 4 civilian victims. And what happened in Gaza was a war. They were systematically bombed. They were bombed from the sea and from the air and from the land. In our last visit, we heard that something similar to that was the Warsaw Ghetto. The people were seeking a place of shelter, a safe shelter, in vain. There was ethnic cleansing carried out by the Israeli victors, and this is a colonial regime which never leaves its territory, sort of thing we've seen in South Africa in the past. We would like an international tribunal into what happened in Gaza. We want to abolish the agreement suspend the agreement with Israel, and the clause relating to human rights is obviously not being respected. And what about a military embargo? How can we be so hypocritical to weep for the dead while carrying on selling weapons to Israel? What's happening in the Gaza Strip is illegal, and the products that are coming from the occupied territories are illegal. How can we buy them? Thank you very much. Mr. Maragall, 1 minute.
Presidente. Thank you, President. Tomorrow we shall be voting on a resolution concerning the situation in Gaza, and we'll find once again that the EU and this European Parliament is making statements only. It's playing a secondary role. It doesn't have any real power in this field. We need to act urgently. Europe needs to do something really immediately about the situation. Look at the situation in Gaza. Look at the European Parliament's delegations. We have missions to talk about various issues, for instance, the whole issue of Gaza and the end of the blockade. Secondly, we also need to look at the responsibility of the State of Israel. They have to face up to their responsibilities. Thirdly, we also need to talk about the Hague International Criminal Court. Make sure that all breaches of human rights, all human rights crimes are prosecuted. We need to really shoulder those responsibilities. And in the meantime, we also need to put on hold the agreement between the EU and the State of Israel. And we also should make sure that no weapons are delivered to this country. Fourth point, at this point in time, the European Union must make sure that we don't have decisions taken which are not in conformity with our values with regard to the State of Israel, because I think if we fail to do that, there will be another armed conflict. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Voigt has the floor for 1 minute.
Ja, danke, Herr Präsident.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wonder what still needs to happen for us in this Parliament not to be judged as being guilty of double standards. Look at what happened yesterday over Russia and Ukraine. Imagine if Russia were to bomb Ukrainian cities, kill Ukrainian children. What would happen in this Parliament? In fact, the same should be happening now when the subject is Israel. You can't have one side getting away with everything unpunished. If you think sanctions have a purpose, then they should be imposed on Israel. The resolution refers to Israel and Palestine after the Gaza conflict, the role of the EU, but it should be Israel and Palestine after the Israeli massacre in Gaza, and then there should be measures to follow, not just declarations.
Mr. Peillon, 1 minute. My dear colleagues, is there any hope for peace now? When you meet the Israelis, when you meet the Palestinians, and I was there twice this year, one has doubts for young generations that are coming, and we hear people taking sides here, people are hoping for negotiations after this drama. I don't think we should have much hope. I don't think we should underestimate the resolution we have on the table when it comes to two particular points. The president of Fatah, President Abbas, can't go to Gaza. So there is a question for the negotiations. Who are the interlocutors? We need to make a success of the reconciliation of the Palestinians. There isn't reconciliation between the Palestinians yet. We can help with the wages of civil servants rather than pronouncing fine speeches. How can we practically, as the European Union, first of all, find a solution over the next few days for the reconciliation between Palestinians? Because in Gaza, even democratic Palestinians can't go in. And secondly, and this is in our motion for resolution, the European Union is ready to carry out border controls and then would say that security is guaranteed, and then we could have the conditions that are necessary for the confidence, and this is something suggested by a colleague just now, that will allow us to go back to this issue of colonization and the embargo. But so while we don't make progress on the first 2 points, the interlocutor and the reconciliation of Palestinians and the control of the borders, people are now building the tunnels again, so you can't have peace, so we need to first of all get the borders back in place. Thank you very much. Mr. Škripek, 1 minute.
Onorevole. Pardon me. Pán predsedajúci,
Mr. President, the Palestinian conflict has cost many human lives, and that is appalling, but we have to understand where the problem came from. Hamas does not issue warnings of its attacks. Hamas hides rockets in schools and hospitals, and it forces Israel to attack these civilian targets where there are women and children. A famous Czech psychiatrist has said that Israel protects its people from rockets, whereas Hamas uses people to protect its rockets. In the European Union's security strategy, it's quite clearly stated that a solution to the Israeli-Arab conflict is a prerequisite to peace in the Middle East. This conflict has to be resolved if we're to face down the threat of terrorism. I call on the European Union to act in favor of peace. Civilian deaths damage the image of Israel in the world. Chancellor Merkel has said that there is no Jewish institution left in Germany that does not ask for police protection. We should all resist the spread of anti-Semitism.
no, mi scusi, c'è una domanda.
Oh, sorry, there's a question for you. Mr. Škripek, do you accept a blue card?
Accetta.
Do you accept the question? Mrs. Rodriguez-RUBIO.
Yeah.
You said earlier on that Hamas doesn't warn the population of Gaza before these bombings, and that's why there were so many civilian victims. Now, I don't know whether you know that in El Haaretz there was a publication of an article recently concerning phone calls that were made 5 minutes before the bombings, urging the population to leave their houses, and 5 minutes were given in order for these people to leave their houses, only 5 minutes.
Could you turn the microphone on, please?
Pani kolegyňa, podľa vás je teda 5 minút dosť?
So you think 5 minutes is time enough? I said Hamas hides its people in schools and hospitals where there are rockets hidden. That's what I said. And I think Israel does issue warnings to the civilian population, so Hamas is causing the conflict.
Viegas.
Now, Mrs. Viegas, no, sorry, Mr. Viegas, 1 minute.
Bom, importa lembrar já agora.
Well, it's important to remember that the Palestinian conflict has been going on since 1947. So you've got to sort of get the context, and you're thinking about Hamas, but you're forgetting about history. And we went along with other comrades to Palestine at the beginning of the month, and we can bear witness to the way in which the people are being treated by the Israelis. You can see the disproportionate means used. I mean, you can't say it is a war between two equal parties. The Palestinian people and us and all those who believe in the peace process, they all think that it's only the peace process that will allow us out of the deadlock, and that what we need is to stop the military and economic support of the US and the EU to Israel. We've got to ensure that there is respect of we've got to ensure there's respect of the association agreement between the EU and Israel. It means both parties have to respect human rights. The Palestinians know that time is running out. We've got to ensure that the Palestinian state is recognized within the 1967 borders and with East Jerusalem as the Palestinian capital. Thank you. Now, Mr. Viegas, there's a question for you. Do you accept?
Gericke.
From Mr. Gericke.
Also ich denke, dass das allgemeine Problem nicht nur zwischen
I think the general problem is not just between Israel and Gaza. It's a Middle East-wide problem. We've actually been talking about the Middle East all afternoon. People need to take responsibility. Jordan has a role. There are refugee camps in Jordan and Syria. In Syria, hundreds of children are dying of hunger. These are UN camps where we can take responsibility. Why shouldn't we first act through the UN?
Prego, onorevole.
You have the floor. Well, I fully agree. The right to return for Palestinian peoples, their right to return to the occupied territories, that's one of the issues that has to be at the core of these negotiations, and this has been referred to in the various meetings that we had with organisations on the spot. Now, of course, let's not get everything mixed up. Let's not make things too complicated so everything would just stay the same. We have to recognise what's actually written in international treaties and apply what's written in international treaties. The EU must condemn Israel. We have an association agreement with Israel which is not being respected because its Article 2 is not being respected. Article 2 should cover the Israeli breaches of human rights. These are practical things. There should be boycotts. We shouldn't sell weapons to Israel anymore. These are simple things. These are weapons that were used to attack children. We have to recognise this, and we have to adopt practical measures without ceasing to take into account the complexity of the issue, but without paralysing our action either.
Grazie.
That was very clear. Thank you very much. And now Mrs. AUKEN has the floor for 1 minute.
Thank you very much. Thank you, President. It seems to me that this debate and this resolution as well are one of the most depressing things I've ever seen. After this horrible war, we could have hoped that the world and the EU would try to step up to the plate and use the measures that they can use. Now, obviously we can't come back to a status quo, says Council. That's fine, but what's actually happening? Nothing. We get nothing. We have a resolution, it's pretty empty. The status quo is there, and of course we can't return to a status quo in Gaza. As if we were just trying to do window dressing, so to speak. This should be an opportunity for us to go forward with sustainable solutions, lasting solutions. I've fought for this for years, but in all honesty, I don't really see how I can speak to my partners in Palestine or in Israel, the left wing in Israel. How can I really say something credible to them when they can see for themselves that we still find ourselves in the same tragic situation? The US has given up, and the EU seems to be shrugging its shoulders. You know, we pay money, but we're not protagonists. We need to change our discourse. We need to speak clearly and openly and say, well, either you have a two-state solution or you don't. We should be fighting for that, for a democratic state. But quite frankly, this is disastrous.
Boris ZALA.
And now we have Mr. Zala, 1 minute.
Colleagues, as we've already heard, the European Union is involved in dozens of activities that have to do with Israel, Palestine, and a solution to the Middle East conflict. But it's not enough. What the European Union is doing is still not enough. The European Union is not a strong enough player to mould events in the Middle East. The European Union as a whole, and not just its individual member states, should use all the levers at its disposal to solve this situation. We scream and shout and adopt resolutions, but we haven't stopped the terrorist acts by Hamas or Hezbollah, nor have we stopped the illegal settlements built by the Israeli government. Let's be honest, we have failed. It's a huge challenge for the High Representative. Maybe not so much for the old one as the new one. We need a real European action plan for Middle East peace, and I mean European, not just of the member states.
Thank you very much. Mr. Younous OMARJEE for 1 minute. Given the violence and the facts, given these war crimes committed in Gaza, given what the Palestinian people has to endure, occupied, colonized, denied the most basic rights, there is, I think, no reason to add any more to the description. We shouldn't use violent words, but our responsibility means that we have to say that the international community and Europe have no excuse at all. At other times it was possible to say that we didn't know, but now we know, and we've allowed these things to happen. We know what's happening at the moment in the Gaza Strip, and we carry on turning our backs, closing our eyes. And during our trip to Jerusalem and Ramallah, we saw amongst the Palestinians that there are still expectations. They still expect something from Europe. It is from Europe that a new incentive could come, as long as we can carry on believing in diplomacy. And I wind up with one word: as long as well that we cease turning Palestinians into hostages of our European bad consciences. We make them the pay for the barbaric experiences of Europe. Mr. Maven Martin, 1 minute.
Thanks very much, President. For the third time in a decade, we will contribute to the rebuilding of Gaza after a conflict. The chronic cycle of violence and violent deterrence has to end. We're all agreed on that. But I have to say, the words we heard from the High Representative's representative and the resolution that we're going to pass tomorrow will make not a slightest difference to the situation in Gaza. Like many others who have spoken, I believe the only solution is a two-state solution. But the combination of illegal Israeli settlements in occupied East Jerusalem and the West Bank and the closure of the Gaza Strip makes it near impossible to achieve this. In fact, every day, every action by the Israelis takes us further and further away from a two-state solution and from a peaceful settlement. I agree with other colleagues who have spoken. Mrs Anderson said it first, I think, but others have mentioned Article 2 in the EU Association Agreement. Until Israel shows it's clear and determined to move down a path of peace, we have to suspend that association agreement. We have to ensure that the guidelines on EU money going into projects in occupied territories is fully implemented. We have to make sure that goods from the occupied territories do not enter the European Union. Until Israel gets the message that the EU is prepared to act, it will not listen to our words.
Honorable Matias. Mrs. Matias, 1 minute. Thank you very much, President. More than 2,000 people died because they're Palestinian. More than 10,000 were injured just because they were Palestinian, because they're in an occupied territory, and in this occupied territory crimes against humanity were committed, and they need to be judged here or anywhere in the world. People who say there should be an investigation of what the Israeli government has done. It's true, Israel should be on the bench. Israel is the defendant here, but no ICC, there is no ICC, there is no international tribunal that would take Israel to court. But as the European Union combined could do that. The European Union stopped being an accomplice. We can't just keep writing down that we don't, we can't say that we don't agree with the occupied territories while failing to suspend the association agreement. We can't be cynical. Every month in this plenary we hold debates, we have urgent motions about crimes against humanity, and every single month in this part session we weep over these crimes. We weep over these crimes against humanity, but it's absolutely a scandal that we carry on with these debates and we don't do nothing. Let's stop being cynical. Let's stop being part of the problem. Honorable Maria. Thank you very much. Mrs. Arena, 1 minute.
La situation de la
The situation of the Palestinian population in Gaza is dramatic, as has been said often. And I would say the situation of the Palestinian people in Palestine has been dramatic for years and years now. The Israeli government has inflicted violence on this population, and they find themselves in a situation that is not just more dramatic, but a humanitarian disaster, very serious. The EU must respond to this. We must act urgently, we must provide for the humanitarian needs of the population in Gaza, and more importantly, I'm pleased to see that a status quo is not a starting point for this debate. Therefore, the EU should also support an agreement, a substantial agreement between these two peoples, these two states. We know that Europe has often been sidelined from these negotiations. There have been failures. It seems to me that the EU now needs to shoulder its diplomatic role, guarantee, of course, the security of Israel. I don't think anyone is questioning that. But at the same time, we're not really talking about the security of Israel right now. We're talking about the security of the Palestinians primarily. And for these Palestinians, there's one thing that's important, namely closer human contact between the Palestinians in Gaza and the Palestinians on the West Bank. We need to work towards that as well.
La parola. Thank you very much. Anne-Marie Mineur now for 1 minute.
Voorzitter, vandaag kreeg ik antwoord op mijn vragen over Gaza van 27 juli. U gaat niets doen aan de permanente...
I'm looking for an answer to my question from July. We keep referring to human rights. We have people wearing t-shirts bearing the words "I love human rights." The damage caused by the war will cost 2.5 times Gaza's GDP to repair. People are just waiting for the next war. That's not acceptable, and we can't just respond with words. Israel must respect international law and the 4th Geneva Convention on human rights in occupied territory. International law is not a matter for political decision. It is compulsory.
Thank you very much. Afzal Khan has the floor now for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen, the loss of human life and damage to properties in this conflict has been shocking. What is even more shocking is the little influence we in the EU have been able to yield, despite the fact that we are Israel's largest trading partner and Palestine's largest aid donor. we have been virtually absent from the Palestinian conflict. We can and need to do more to find a permanent solution in this long and ongoing conflict. We should not tolerate the collective punishment of Palestinians. We should therefore demand that Israel opens Gaza borders. Israel must halt and withdraw from all illegal settlements which are currently undermining the two-state solution. We must also support the investigation of war crimes. Failing this, we should suspend the human rights clause in the EU-Israel Association Agreement, and we should stop pretending that Israel follows international norm. And if we need to, we should consider imposing sanctions against Israel, and that includes military sanctions, as we have done against Russia. Thank you.
Grazie.
Mr. Pargneaux, there's no microphone for the President. Mr. Pargneaux.
Je suis le dernier de ce...
Thank you, President. I'm the last speaker on the list for this debate in the chamber. We've been talking about this for an hour now. I'm the last on the list, and I have to say that I have a bitter taste in my mouth following this debate. I feel bitter because I've heard, if you like, prosecutors on both sides. I've heard people calling for more war on both sides. Two different messages I've heard in this debate. And yet it seems to me that in the European Parliament there is a very broad majority that supports peace. We want peace. There is a balanced approach. We can say stop to everything that we experienced for 7 weeks with thousands of men, women and children, particularly on the Palestinian side, who were massacred. Put an end to that. And we also know that in this region we have jihadist terrorists. Whether you're talking about Iraq, which we talked about earlier on, or whether you're talking about al-Nusra in Syria, whether you're talking about Egypt with the partisans of Jerusalem, and so on and so forth. So we know that the only solution is peace. We need to pave the way for peace. We need to find a credible way forward, a credible diplomacy on the part of the European Union as well. That is what I'm calling for. Let's come back to the Oslo Accord. Let's come back to the European initiatives, because we know that there is a premise there, a reasonable premise vis-à-vis Israel and vis-à-vis Palestine. My colleague Mr. Peillon earlier on talked about a number of proposals which he has tabled before this House. I very much hope that a broad majority will support the resolution. That's one thing, but I also hope that a broad majority within this chamber will move towards peace.
Thank you very much. Now we have to catch the eye. Mrs. Morvai has the floor for 1 minute.
Thank you very much. The state of Israel every few years or so murders thousands of Palestinians, and it land grabs in Gaza. They do this regularly. Why? Because they can. They can because there are no consequences, apparently. I would like to turn to the representative of the European Council here, and I would like to ask you the following questions. First of all, what is the EU doing about war criminals, making sure that they are actually held accountable for their actions? Second question, what is the European Union doing about the damages caused to make sure that there is liability for those damages on the part of Israel? It shouldn't be the European taxpayer paying for the bill, footing the bill and reconstructing whatever Israel has destroyed. And third question, it is quite clear that Israel is violating various pieces of legislation, in particular the Israel-EU agreement, particularly Article 2 thereof. It's been breached time and time again by the State of Israel. So when are you going to suspend that agreement between the EU and Israel? Thank you.
Onorevole Vallina.
Mrs. Vallina for 1 minute.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, President. Yesterday, during the debate on the agreement with Ukraine, we had some very fine speeches from many of the commissioners and from other members of Parliament. A fine speech from President Schulz himself. But, for example, we are creating the foundations for law, or you would never have been able to imagine that the law of the jungle would be used against the weakest. But that's what's happening. And this afternoon, when we're talking about Iraq and Syria, we've heard more or less the same sort of thing. So I have a question. why do we have double standards in the European Union? Why are we so hypocritical as regards Israel? If we have a country which doesn't respect international law at all, doesn't respect the rulings of the Hague Tribunal or the UN decisions or borders of other countries, a country which commits crimes against humanity, steals the land of the Palestinians, and imprisons Palestinians with total impunity, kills Palestinians, and the EU looks the other way. And Gaza, the Gaza Strip now, well, that was a genocide, and in fact it's an open-air prison that we have in the Gaza Strip. No one can go in, no one can go out, according to the agency of the UN, and the Israelis don't even allow humanitarian aid to go in, and that there are 33 members of the administration, of the Palestinian administration, who are in jail. You know what this means. Bow. Thank you very much. Now Mrs. Bilbao for 1 minute. Last speaker.
Prego.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you very much, President. Passivity, paralysis, fear, absence, a slow approach. Unfortunately, these are the adjectives that describe our actions so far with regard to Gaza. Now, these rockets from the Strip, yes, of course they are an act of violence, but the way in which this was then replied to, with bombings, with the assassination of children, you know, the collateral damage caused is disproportionate. In 2006, in the month of October, I was there in Ramallah, the seat of the parliament there, and I heard about events there. And I heard that things could not continue in this way. They would get worse unless we helped out. We need solutions for peace, we need solidarity, we need a human approach, and we need to make sure that fundamental human rights are respected by Israel, just as we expect other countries to respect these human rights. It's a question of dignity, of credibility, and of justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's the end of the debate. And now I'll give the floor to the Council. Benedetto Della Vedova has the floor. Thank you. Thank you, President. And I'd like to thank the members who took part in the debate. The European Union supports peace and democracy in the entire Middle East and makes a major contribution to bringing an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which, as long as we still have this unresolved, will continue to undermine peace and security in the entire Middle East and along the southern borders of the European Union. The recent explosion of violence in Israel in the Gaza Strip cruelly reminds us of the urgency to act in order to bring about an end to this conflict. The events demonstrate that there will never be a definitive cessation of violence nor a lasting peace until the aspirations of the Palestinian people to their own sovereign state, and until the aspirations and hopes of the Israelis for security until they've been satisfied through an overall negotiated peace, global peace, based on the coexistence of two states. Along with its partners in the international community and in the region, the European Union will continue appealing to Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Abbas so that they will commit themselves in good faith to authentic negotiations and cooperate in order to achieve a lasting solution to the conflict. The European Union is called upon to play an important role in this context and intends to carry on doing this over the critical weeks and months to come. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Mr. Della Vedova. The debate, which was a rather sort of lonely debate at the end, is now over. I've received 7 motions resolution to wind up the debate. The debate is closed and the vote will take place tomorrow at midday. The next sitting will be held on Thursday, the 18th of September, from 9 to 2 o'clock, and the agenda has been published and is available on the website of the European Parliament. The sitting is adjourned. Have a pleasant evening.